Hi, this is John Romano, and this is a lecture on Imperial China, and specifically the Yuan Dynasty and its aftermath. Now, we had seen previously in our discussion of Imperial China that nomadic peoples had often attacked the northern area in China. We said in particular, during the last of the dynasties we discussed, the Sung Dynasty, China faced a large number of attacks by nomads, which would end up threatening some of its important cities. Now, among the different groups that would attack China, none would prove to become more threatening and more destructive than a group that we'll focus on today, a group known as the Mongols. You can see here just one image of a Mongol on a horse. No horse is probably quite that fat in reality, but there you have it. And here what you see is the kind of territory that Mongols originally issue from. This territory in Central Asia that is known as steppe lands. And you can see the sort of desolate kind of territory that they came from, with enough vegetation to be able to graze their horses, but certainly not to be able to do much agriculture. We think that previous to their interaction with China, the Mongols previously were really showed deep loyalty to their familial groups, really they were very, very tightly organized into these kind of groups. Occasionally, the Mongols in the past would make alliances, sometimes with Turkish speakers in the area. But so far as we can see, Mongols did not play any leading role in the organization of any large-scale states until the 13th century. And we think that the Mongols certainly were loyal to their kinship groups, but they were not loyal to anything larger than that. What the real difference then in the early 13th century was this individual whose picture I put up a moment ago. He's really going to represent the turning point for the career of the Mongols. And this is, of course, a court portrait of the person we know as Genghis Khan. And as we'll see, the accomplishment of Genghis Khan was to forge the various Mongol groups into one very powerful alliance that would, in time, build the largest the empire the world had ever seen. Now, I told you that Genghis Khan is not this man's birth name. You can see that his name on the outline is Temujin. It really was not until later on in his career, a moment that we'll speak about soon, that people would begin to refer to him by the term Genghis Khan. And both of these terms are actually have a different meaning. So far as we can tell, the term Genghis appears to mean something like oceanic, as if to say he rules from ocean to ocean. He is universal. The name Khan is not really a name so much as a military title like general that was given out among the Mongols. And there would be one Khan who was most powerful among them, the Great Khan, whereas there were also lesser Khans as well, even after Genghis Khan's time. Genghis Khan was initially born into a noble family among the Mongols. We know that his father, even before he would emerge as a major fighter, as Genghis Khan would, his father was a prominent warrior too. He also, his father appeared to have had a gift to be able to bring together different Mongol clans together. And Many people think that had his life not been interrupted, it really might have been Genghis's father, who would actually create this new sort of super Mongol alliance. Alas, we'll never know. It ends up that his father, Genghis Khan's father, is poisoned when Genghis Khan is 10 years old. His father was engaging in one of the standard rituals that Mongol groups would do when they saw one another. They would both offer one another something to eat or drink, and what Genghis Khan received was mare's milk, fermented mare's milk, which is one of the things that Mongols like to drink a lot. Unfortunately, his milk had been poisoned, and so that was the end of his life. At this point, Genghis Khan had one of the most trying times in his life. Very quickly, his father's allies abandoned him. He was just too young to be able to really lead armies. So we think that Genghis Khan will live this precarious existence. He didn't have a huge amount of money at his disposal. He was constantly running, constantly trying to elude his enemies, who might have wanted to kill him off. We know at least once he ends up escaping from prison. In time, though, we're going to see that Genghis Khan begins to turn this situation around. He will make an alliance with another prominent Mongol clan leader. We also see that Genghis Khan, or maybe perhaps just from years of observation, really got very good at the art of how to strategize one's position among the Mongols, how to gain more authority, how to make friends, how to betray your old friends when they no longer were useful to you, how to make new friends. All of this started, though, with displays of courage in battle. And we know that Genghis Khan was personally very brave in battle. Also, he was very good at finding strong allies to stick by his side. And it will get perhaps one of the signs of his later genius. He constantly was able to bring tribes that previously had been totally unaffiliated into his sphere, making them his friends. This strengthened his position, and we think that as he gets more and more people on his side, he begins to turn and fight against many of the other powerful leaders within the Mongol society, until finally he has vanquished them all. And it is at this point that an assembly of Mongol leaders will then give him this name, Genghis Khan. They'll proclaim him this position. And we think at this point then he recognizes, Genghis Khan recognizes that he is going to have to use this newfound authority quickly. He's going to have to give people a payback for having given him this new title. As Genghis Khan begins to prepare for war, he decides that one of the keys to victory is making sure that now all Mongols are loyal to him. And so he begins to break up the previous tribal organization and to completely reorganize the military. The attitude is, of course, that all of these people are meant to be fighting together as one cohesive whole. They shouldn't just be loyal to their own only family members, because Mongols previously had fought side to side with their brothers. He also, we think Genghis Khan had an eye for how to choose talent. He was always choosing people who were capable, who were loyal to him. With all this still, you may wonder, how was it that the Mongols, whom we've never spoken about before in this class, were able to fight so ably. I mean, how many men could they even field? Well, what's interesting is that essentially all the male members of Mongol civilization were part of the army. So even though they, on the overall, did not have a huge number of people in their civilization, they did have a very large army, around 125,000 in all. This army, and you can get some idea of this from these pictures I've been showing, they relied on outstanding equestrian skill. They were good horse riders. Mongols grew up riding horses. They would constantly play all these games. They would hunt on horseback. So by the time they became adults, they could really use these horses quite effectively. We also think that the Mongols learned to use bows and arrows, and then they could kill off many of their enemies at long distance. The horses also meant that the Mongols could be highly mobile, and they moved very quickly. On top of all of these other things, we think that the Mongols used a psychological advantage over their enemies. If those they were going against in battle laid down their weapons and surrendered without any resistance, the Mongols were known to spare their lives and make generous treatment, especially for people they felt they could use later on, people who could fight with them, artisans who could build things. If people chose to actually fight against them, the attitude of the Mongols was that they would just slaughter everyone. So you really had to think about whether or not it was worth fighting in battle against them. And many people made the decision that indeed it was not worth their while. Once Genghis Khan had united the Mongols, Genghis Khan turned his army to other parts of Central Asia, attacking other nomads first. This actually was quite clever in a way, in that it meant that it would secure his position at the top of the Mongols, make sure there was no other nomadic leaders who could potentially challenge him. What really begins to change the Mongols, though, because this nomadic warfare had been going on for a long time, was when they begin now to look to their neighbors and China. We, perhaps like everyone else, recognizing, first of all, that the Sung dynasty was relatively weak. Second of all, really recognizing as well that China was so rich, they begin to raid the northern part of China, an area where already a lot of nomadic peoples had entered. Initially, this was simply a series of raids, but in time it would grow to a campaign of conquest. Part of this army would continue on in China. Another part of the army would turn to Eastern Europe and the Middle East. This here, without going blow by blow, this map gives you an idea of the huge extent of the final conquest, which again had been begun by Genghis Khan, but then finished by his successors. No matter where they went, we think that especially Genghis Khan's conquests were synonymous with destruction and death on the conquered land. There were reports of cities being ravaged, buildings being demolished, and people being killed. As I mentioned earlier, as the Mongol attacks went on, they didn't necessarily have to attack with such force in time, because people already knew about these tactics and surrendered more quickly. Also, in recent years, it has become clear that in addition to some of their other sort of terrible deeds, we know that Genghis Khan himself would either willingly or unwillingly take all sorts of women and have children with them. We can see this by modern DNA studies. Y chromosomes of certain people have been analyzed, and altogether, we think that Genghis Khan would end up having around 16 million descendants, and you can get a very quick idea of where they are, and just by the size of these individual circles, how many people are descendants of his in these various regions. Altogether, we think by the time of his death, Genghis Khan had then laid the foundation for a vast and mighty empire. Although not an empire that really had any idea of how to rule. There was nothing like administration. He simply took money from people. The consolidation of Mongol rule would occur during the reign of the next Mongol ruler I'm going to talk about, someone whose picture I've put up here, a man by the name of Kublai Khan. Kublai Khan was one of Genghis Khan's grandsons, and most people would say he was the most talented of his descendants the way he ruled. And to some degree, Kublai Khan's reign was more of the same. The Mongols did not let up their ruthless attacks against their enemies. But we also see that Kublai Khan takes something of a greater interest in cultural matters than Genghis Khan ever did. And finally really begins to start having to act like more of a governor over these territories he was taking. Really becoming concerned about the welfare of his subjects, showing generosity to the poor, building roads, for instance. All of these things begin to look a lot more like government to us. It was fair to say that also one of the policies that Kublai Khan embodied, and something that would really continue with other Mongol emperors, was a real tolerance for different religious traditions. In some degree, the Mongols felt that the most important thing was that all their subjects show their political allegiance that they recognized who their overlord was. But they really made much less of a difference to them what religion individual people professed. We know that traditional Mongols before they became in contact with other peoples, had traditionally embraced a form of shamanism, a religion that was read by these priest-like figures known as shamans. Here's just a modern example of the Mongols shown today. Shamans were believed to have the ability to go into this trance-like state where then their souls were able to communicate with gods and spirits to help living Mongols. And we know in particular that the Mongols really believed a lot in sky gods and some other nature gods. And one of the reasons why shamans often would wear these sky blue colors was because of the importance of sky gods to them. Now, even after the conquest, some of the Mongols will continue to hold some of these same beliefs in shamans and their abilities. But the more people who were conquered, the more religions that certain Mongols would choose to adapt. There were some we know who become Taoists, some Mongols become Buddhists, some become Muslims, and there was also a Christian presence within the Mongol Empire. We think that Kublai Khan will be the person who will finally cap off the conquest in China. And in addition to completely wiping out the old Sung Dynasty, we think he will proclaim himself an emperor and name a new imperial Chinese dynasty, the Yuan Dynasty. We also see that the Mongols will continue to make some forays elsewhere in Asia, but it must be admitted with very little success. The kind of tactics that we see the Mongols using did not tend to adapt very well to the sort of humid and tropical jungles of southeastern Asia. For instance, in Vietnam. This is an area in which there was very little land to pasture their horses, and we also see that they don't really adapt well to guerrilla warfare. As we'll discuss more elsewhere too, the Mongols will make two naval attacks on Japan, but in both cases, because of storms, they will fail. Mongols, however, would meet with more success, especially further in the West, in areas, as I mentioned, of Eastern Europe and the Middle East, and both of which cases Mongols will establish governments there. We do think that that altogether, the transition of Mongols to governors or administrators was something that was a difficulty. And really, this was especially pronounced in China. We think that the Mongols tended to stand aloof from most of their Chinese subjects, and they really scorn them to some degree as just a bunch of peasants. We think that we see that the Mongols will outlaw any intermarriage between Mongols and the Chinese, and they will actually forbid Chinese people from learning the Mongol language, which allowed them, of course, to say very unkind things about the Chinese in their presence. There is even a story that said that at one point Genghis Khan even contemplated wiping out the Chinese altogether and just using their land as pasture land. And supposedly the only thing that stopped him was one of his men said, but Genghis, think of all the land that we would, think of all that the money that we would lose from taxes if you were to do that. And that's the only reason he decided not to. We can see, though, that if there is an idea here, is that in many cases, the Mongols, recognizing their limitations with administration, they would bring all kinds of administrators from other places in their empire to help them reign over areas. So they're not necessarily people who are Mongols, but simply loyal people who are their subjects. Some people think that one of the most interesting sort of results of the Mongol rule in China was that they tended to sponsor interaction among people from Asia far into the West, a sort of travel and communication. And the reason for this is simple. Say what you want about them. The Mongols were this overwhelming military force. And just because of people had such fear of their arms, it made, for instance, the Silk Road far safer to travel on than it had been for a long time. So this allowed all sorts of merchants to go out and to peddle their wares. Again, as long as they're giving some tax money to the Mongols. We also see, too, that just to give you some idea, by the way, here's some of the coins that were issued by the Mongols while they were in charge of China. The Mongols would also continue to make paper money, which, as we had said, was something that already had been created in Imperial China, but was continued under their rule. And this gives some idea of the many sort of goods, fine goods that were traveling out of China, like porcelain, under the time of the Mongols. And again, they're both receiving and sending out merchants at this time period. To just one striking example, of the kind of goods that are leaving China. This is one illumination by an Armenian bishop. And if you look at his liturgical vestment, his chasuble, in the lower left-hand corner, you'll actually see a Chinese dragon on it, because that is the origin of this vestment. And again, it traveled for hundreds of miles to arrive in his hands. And here's just, again, a Muslim coin that has the name of one of the Muslim rulers on it. We also know that, in part because they probably wanted to get on good terms with the Mongols, that many foreign rulers would send diplomatic legations to the Mongol capital city to speak to their khans. To give you just one of many examples, this is the path of a man named William of Rubruck, who was a diplomat who had come from Western Europe. He originally came from Belgium, and he was a Franciscan. In particular, it appears that one of the compulsions for him to travel in this territory is that he was excited about the possibility that all of this area between Western Europe and China could be mission territory. You know, Franciscans were known for their ability to preach. The nature of William Rubruck's mission is he intentionally seems to keep a little bit secret in what he wrote about it. It appears that he had actually received his mission from the King of France, and that the King of France wanted to gain as much information as possible about the Mongols and their military capabilities, should in the future they ever get closer to Western Europe, which fortunately they did not, because they end up never actually conquering Western Europe. William of Rubruck ends up traveling this enormous distance. We think that he really has a considerable amount of trouble managing to convert anyone, because he does not speak any of the languages of the people in these areas. And his translator is completely unreliable. He ends up getting drunk more than once. When he finally arrives at the capital of the Mongols, William is not really treated extremely well, although he does end up engaging in this very interesting debate among representatives of three different religions: Christianity, the Muslims, and Taoists, all of whom present their case to the Mongol emperor. This debate doesn't have a proper conclusion. It ends up breaking down, really. And in fact, the Christians and the Muslims end up basically ganging up against the Taoists. But this is possibly the only place in the world where one could really debate religion in this way at this time. And just to give you some idea, this is one of the letters the Mongols composed that would eventually find its way back to the King of France. And it is fair to say neither the King of the French or anyone else in Western Europe had really prepared for a Mongol invasion. So it was just lucky that it never happened. We think that in addition to giving more work for diplomats, Mongols also at times would resettle people who had specialized skills that they were in need of, whether it be soldiers, bodyguards, administrators, translators. Translation was a big deal, because so many people spoke different languages, this emperor. Doctors, metal workers, they were willing to hire whoever had the skills that they could use. Soon after the death of Kublai Khan, we tend to think there was decline in the Chinese part of the Mongol Empire. We think that the Mongol emperors had a very bad monetary policy. They had simply too little metal to back up the paper money they were printing, which in fact meant that the money became useless and prices began to rise. We also think that really, especially among the upper echelon of Mongol societies, there were so many ambitious Mongols who would fight with one another constantly to gain the power that, in fact, it ended up weakening the position of emperor there. We also think that there is a disease factor that will really, in some ways, help to destroy their power. And it actually is one of the very cruel ironies of history that we usually think it is a good thing for people to be in greater contact with one another, to spread ideas and things. And the Mongols had really inadvertently managed to open up much more of a corridor of all sorts of peoples from the west to the east by their presence. Another thing, though, that they sponsor through creating these new connections between people is the spread of the plague. And in fact, the plague will erupt throughout China. And this is the same Black Plague that we'll discuss in greater detail when we talk about Western Europe. But here it's important just to note that this is not just a disease of Western Europe, and the disease will also spread to the east, and it will very seriously disrupt the economy and society in China, as well as in Western Europe. And the same sort of things that we'll talk about that occur elsewhere. Depopulation, a great amount of death, labor shortages will occur in China. And needless to say, of course, this certainly didn't make the Chinese any happier with the rule of the Mongols. Altogether, too, we think that many peasants, of course, in the past, when they felt they had been abused in China, their one refuge, the one thing they could do was to rebel. And in fact, all of these different circumstances added with this general hate that the Chinese felt for the Mongols, created a huge rebellion. In some strange way, it appears that later Mongol leaders in China were much better at fighting with one another than they were in putting down a large-scale revolt by peasants. And at least some people thought that these people had grown soft after 3 generations of living off the vast wealth of China. This native-led revolt of the Chinese would establish a new Chinese dynasty known as the Ming. As for the Mongols, to some degree, I think they recognized that there was no hope of holding on to China, and intelligently they decided that their best course of actions was simply to get on their horses and to return to their old steppe lands, return back to Central Asia. Now, as an outsider, you might think that the Mongols would have caused a challenge to the kind of older Chinese traditions, and that, in fact, the Ming would have really significantly changed the way that they ruled when they came into power after the shock of having lost their country to outsiders. Yet, if you were to think that, you would be incorrect. In effect, what is so surprising to many people about the way that the Ming choose to rule is that in some ways they appear to want to go back to the way things were before the Mongols came into power, without any admission that there may be flaws in their system. which allowed the Mongols to get into power initially. So, for instance, they would follow the same old Chinese tax machinery. They would have the same exact bureaucracy, which was once again chosen by meritocracy, by the same sort of examination system. We think that for the vast majority of people, it really meant that life was exactly the same as before. And so some people think, at least internally in China, there was very little lasting change as the result of the Mongol reign. And in fact, if there was a change, it was to be even harsher about repudiating foreign ways. You can imagine that if the Chinese had already tended to believe that the rest of the world were really a group of barbarians, the Mongols had really reinforced this impression and had really convinced them even further that there was little to gain from the outside world. And so some people would say that the effect of Mongols was much more significant for the things that were able to depart from China while they were in power, the things that went to other civilizations. Some of these sort of technological advances we've talked about here, gunpowder, the compass, the printing press, all of these would spread into Muslim and eventually Christian territories, usually through merchants. In China, all of these innovations continued to be used, but in some ways, these new technologies were used to strengthen old traditions. So yes, they had the printing press, but they tended to use the printing press to read the same sort of classics. So think about something like, for instance, Confucius. And in fact, to even disseminate these same sort of seminal texts more widely, but the same texts. Yes, the Chinese had gunpowder before anyone else, but they tended to allow, for instance, the emperor to strengthen his power against Chinese rebels. And I should say along the same lines that China would certainly arrive at gunpowder first, but they never made guns or gunpowder quite as lethal as later European ones. Perhaps for us, always most strikingly, based upon what we know from later Western European tradition, is that the Chinese certainly had the technology to explore the world, but they never really capitalize on it. So, for instance, I've been showing you here, they were certainly good at making maps, first of all, to be able to explore. The most interesting example of this tendency to shy away from exploration we'll see at the first half of the 15th century in the Ming Dynasty. One of the most interesting attempts at exploration comes under a court eunuch known as Zheng He, whose grave you can see here. Zheng He became a court favorite, and his attitude was that the Chinese ought to be exploring a lot more. Because he had imperial backing, he was able to get 250 ships and thousands of men to participate in his expedition. So a truly imperial scale of expedition. Here I'm just showing you one of the many journeys that Zheng He would take into places, for instance, around the Indian Ocean, India, areas in modern-day Saudi Arabia, in areas also in East Africa. Whenever he went to these places, he would force the rulers of these distant lands to pledge their allegiance to the Chinese emperor and to give products over to him. And this probably had very little practical practical effect, but it does show us still that the Chinese really feel that they're living in the Middle Kingdom, and all other areas should be their subjects, be beneath them. Now, when Genghis would arrive back into China, he would bring all kinds of wonders with him. It just is just one famous example that he brings a giraffe back to China, and various other marvels that people in China had never seen. Yet it is unfortunate for him that it appears that Genghis would in time fall out of favor with the emperor of the Ming Dynasty. Once this happened, the emperor abruptly orders the suspension of Genghis explorations, but the idea of explorations entirely. And in fact, Genghis falls so far out of favor that any memory of these expeditions is completely suppressed. And in fact, to show just how they were doubling down on this idea that exploration was dead, the government actually forbade the construction of seagoing vessels, with the fear that if they created these ships and they were stolen, it might lead to piracy. The result of the government, of course, destroying its own ships was that piracy becomes a major issue, because there's no one to stop private pirates anymore. It is fair to say that it would have been a very different world if the Chinese emperor had beaten European explorers to the punch. Or if, in fact, simply if Chinese merchants had been left to their own devices. In effect, really, the Chinese government begins to prohibit private ventures on the sea, not only public ones. Just to give you some, just a very imprecise idea about what a head start China would have had on exploration had they gone down that path. This is just one diorama that shows the difference in size between the ships that Genghis had and the ships that Columbus had. Of course, with Genghis being the much larger ones. Bear in mind, too, that Genghis had 250 ships, while Columbus had 3. Altogether, what this means is that despite the huge head start China had on other civilizations, we do not think it ever really capitalized on its own potential. To some degree, in the coming centuries, much of its actions would be confined to East Asia. To some degree, we think that there is, although certainly there's innovation in certain fields, in other fields in Chinese life, things remain remarkably the same. We know, for instance, that Chinese agriculture always depended a lot more on human labor than animals, which meant that the Chinese continued to have relatively low productivity per capita in comparison with, for instance, Europe. So the lives of most Chinese were for centuries really very little altered, either in appearance or reality. Most of them were desperately poor, and they were confined to villages. Artisans tended to really only produce luxury items, their skills, the benefit of their skills did not necessarily extend further throughout society. In fact, merchants, who, as we said, at least in the Mongol period, made out very well, were increasingly thought to be disreputable people. For the most part, they tended to serve, to cater the needs of only a very small subsection of society. And altogether, we don't think that merchants, even in spite of the wealth they got, ever really managed to break the power of the traditional landholding class, so where people traditionally had money. We think to some degree, too, the large amount of taxes and the control that the government would place over merchants would further help to discourage new business. And altogether, what some people think ends up happening is that the Chinese had created a system so overwhelming that it actually had managed to some degree, contain change and regulate it so even when change occurs, it does not harm the traditional system that had been set up within the civilization. In some very strange way, the success of Chinese civilization led to a lack of growth. The entire goal here really was the assurance of continuity and the prevention of any fundamental change. Innovation was not celebrated. In the end, then, this is why it was a genuine shock to many in China. If we fast forward all the way to the 19th century, when many Western European powers would end up surpassing China. In effect, this ends up leading to a lot more soul-searching over whether or not the amount of continuity they had maintained was actually so much of a positive thing after all. Great. Thank you.